Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Minnesota Transformation Initiative's quarterly provider training series. My name is Stacy Jones. I'm one of the team members on this project. And today's topic is using community life engagement as a pathway to and a wraparound for employment. Some quick housekeeping before we get started. As we just noted, this training is being recorded, and a link to that recording will be sent out following the webinar, along with a copy of the slide deck that we're going to be sharing today, to anybody that's registered. The recording will also be uploaded to the MTI website, and that's the same place that you would have registered for this training. And the web address is up on the screen if people need to make note of that as well. Also of note, at the end of this training, we'll be sharing a training evaluation link. So you all can take a minute to provide our team with any feedback about the session and about subject areas in the future that you'd like to see covered as part of this series. As a reminder, the MTI project is made possible by a grant from the Minnesota Department of Human Services to the Institute on Community Integration at the University of Minnesota and the Institute for Community Inclusion at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. The MTI project really is designed to provide support and technical assistance, resources, and trainings like this one to organizations in Minnesota as you all transform business models away from sub-minimum wage 14C certificate usage to models that prioritize competitive integrated employment and community life engagement outcomes. And on the screen, you can see some other partners that are part of this project. As I mentioned, you can visit the website if you'd like to get some more information. I am very pleased to introduce our two guest presenters today. First, I have this extreme pleasure of introducing Karen Lee. Karen has been the executive director of Seek Incorporated, a disability service provider in Maryland since 1990. And under Karen's leadership, Seek has grown from a $100,000 budget to one that's over $23 million. Karen has worked with her team at Seek to build an infrastructure that supports competitive integrated employment and community life engagement that help people with disabilities to belong and thrive in a life of their choosing. And along with her role at Seek, Karen has also supported Maryland's Developmental Disabilities Administration in creating and implementing Maryland's Employment First policies, a strategic plan, and since then has also joined the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, or ODEP, and Administration on Community Living as a subject matter expert on multiple grants and initiatives. Karen works with federal and state governments as well as providers to increase career pathways for direct support professionals and increase access and capacity to competitive integrated employment. Also joining Karen today, also equally thrilled to introduce Dr. Jen Selesky. Jen is the Associate Director and Assistant Research Professor at University of New Hampshire and is a national expert on community life engagement for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. She has conducted extensive research on how to improve day services and supports to better promote the outcomes of community life engagement, some of which Jen will be talking about today. Jen is a fellow of the American Association of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. Jen received her PhD in social policy from Brandeis University. And with that, I am going to turn things over to Jen to kick things off.
Thanks, Stacy. So I'm always thrilled to be talking about community life engagement and what we can all do to improve community life engagement for people with disabilities. And I always like to start off with defining what is community life engagement. And so we talk about this as all the ways that people with IDD, and really people without IDD too, so people in general, how they access and participate in their communities outside of employment as part of a meaningful day. It's definitely arguable that employment is also a form of community life engagement, but our focus today is really on those non-work activities and how those can be supported. It's important also to note that we're talking about community life engagement as an outcome, not as a service. There are various types of services and various names for those services that can lead to community life engagement, but it's an outcome, and it's an outcome that we all have, as I said. It's can include all the things that you and I and anybody does in their non-work time, accessing community facilities, volunteering, being involved at our church or a local environmental organization or civic participation. And that can also include post-secondary or continuing education. So next slide. And so we're talking about employment today, though, and how does this relate to employment? Well, community life engagement can lead to employment through career exploration and networking. A lot of us have found jobs through people that we knew from other parts of our lives, or discovered what we wanted to do by exploring that through other opportunities. It can wrap around employment, particularly for people who work part-time, which is true for a lot of people with developmental disabilities, to fill gaps in their schedules or gaps in experiences they would like to have or types of social connection they want. And it can support people in retirement, in integrated retirement opportunities. Another reason we want to look at community life engagement alongside employment is that if you look at the people served in the disability system in day and employment services, we've had, some shrinkage of facility-based or sheltered workshop work. We've had some increase of integrated employment, but the biggest growth has been in the number of people participating in non-work day services. So this is a big proportion of the people that are receiving services, and it's important to be aware of what those people are doing and what kind of quality supports they're receiving. So to give a little bit of background on the research that these ideas come from, ICI has been doing research on community life engagement since well before 2014, but I'm just going to give you the latest set of studies. So in 2014, 2015, we did a set of expert interviews and defined the idea of an expert pretty broadly to encompass people with disabilities, family members, direct support providers, provider and state agency staff, in addition to the sort of academic experts that we might typically think of when we say an expert. And from those came the 4 guideposts for community life engagement, which are going to provide the framework for today's presentation. We also then did case studies of providers that were successfully supporting people in engaged community lives, used the ideas that we gained from those case studies to develop out those 4 guideposts and create a toolkit of ideas and concepts for service providers. We then piloted the guideposts and the toolkit with 7 providers in 2 states, and most recently, we've developed the Guidepost Fidelity Scale. It's actually now called the Community Life Engagement Fidelity Scale, and a set of online modules for direct support providers. So I mentioned the 4 guideposts, and the way today's presentation is going to work is after I finish my introduction and Karen finishes her, we're going to take turns talking about each of these guideposts. So I'm just going to name them now, but we'll come back to what they mean in a little while. So the first one is individualizing supports for each person. Guidepost 2 is promoting community membership and contribution. Guidepost 3, use human and social capital to decrease dependence on paid supports. That one is a little jargony, but I'm going to talk about what it means in a few minutes. And then Guidepost 4 is ensuring that supports are outcome-oriented and regularly monitored. And like I said, these guideposts form the framework for the CLE toolkit, which there's a link to on this slide. And the latest research, as I mentioned, we've been developing this community life engagement fidelity scale. It's a short questionnaire that you can complete yourself, have your staff complete, and it just gives you a sense of what areas you're scoring higher or lower in, to think about where you might want to focus your efforts on improving how your day services and supports can lead to community life engagement for the people you support. And we'll also be putting up a few of the questions from this scale in poll questions as we go through the webinar today too. I'm going to hand over to Karen next.
Karen, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Welcome to everybody. And I just checked the weather, and it's 71 degrees here in Washington, D.C., and it's 75 degrees in Alexandria, Minnesota, where my mom and dad are right now at the cabin, opening up the cabin, right? Because it's Memorial Day weekend. So we always open up our cabin on Memorial Day weekend. Everybody's going up north. So I just want to thank you for being on, because I know it's a rarity to have this kind of beautiful weather in Minnesota. And so I really appreciate that you're on for this time of year. So this is one of my favorite quotes, because this is definitely describes our journey as professionals who work with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And as Stacy said, I'm the CEO of SEEK here in Silver Spring, Maryland. I can just look out my window and see Washington, D.C. We're just right on the border of Washington, D.C. But I started my career at the Op Shop. You all know the Op Shop in Minneapolis. We had a Clarador Club in Lindley Hall. They were 2 dormitories full of people with disabilities. And today we would never do that. We would never have people with intellectual and developmental disabilities living in these great, big, huge places. And Maya Angelou said it best, is do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. And that's really describes our careers as professionals in this field. All of us, it describes the work that we've done. And today what Jen and I are going to do is we're going to bring you some more information so you know better, so you can do better. We all do it every single day. We learn from the people we support, we learn from families, we learn from research, we learn from our DSPs. And so it's really not a matter of saying what we did was wrong, but it's a matter of us accepting the fact that we are learning more. And now that we know more, we can know better, we can do better. And so I just want you to remember that in any transition work we do, we never want to belittle the work that people before us did, or the work that we did before we knew better. And you being on today shows that you really do want to know better, and I really appreciate that. And so we're going to give you some of those tools so that you do know how to do this work better, because this work is difficult work, no question, and it's evolving and we're learning, and it's important for us to all be on that journey together. Stacy, you want to advance? So a lot of these things might be things that you know already. When we started the World About Community Engagement, these are some of the things we did. One of the gifts that I'm hoping that we can bring to you is you don't have to go through the same mistakes that everybody else did before you as they learned about this. Certainly, we started off with this whole idea of, people were segregated in sheltered workshops. I actually did a stint at the UCP workshop over at Edison High School in St. Louis Park, and man, some of the stories of the people who worked there, they still live with me today. That was a really long time ago, and they still really live with me today. But I know that we started in a situation like that, and then we started to do things like programs without walls. That's what we were calling it, right? So people can be out in the community. We also started with community classes. Maybe they'd be in the center-based program or in the sheltered work, and then they would go to a music class at the YMCA, or maybe they would go take a fitness class at the community center, or in the basement of the church, they'd go learn how to do cooking with a group of people with disabilities. Those are all those kinds of things that we've done along the way. And then we'd say, oh no, we're just going to use our building as a hub. And as my former board members used to say, that our old building looked like National Airport, because the buses would come in, people would get out, they'd go in there, and then they'd go out for the day, and then they'd come back in, and they'd get their lunch, and they'd get their food, and they'd meet with a nurse, they'd do all those kinds of things, and they'd get back out again, they'd go do something else, they'd come back, and then they'd go home. And it was like National Airport. The buses are coming and going and coming and going. And so now we're talking about leaving that behind. And the gift that I hope we can give you is that you don't have to go through those stages of going from what you're doing now to people having opportunities in their lives to be a full part of their community. You don't have to go through that shutting down period or the building something that's not going to work. We already do know what doesn't work, and we do know what does work, and that's that fidelity scale is such a great tool. And in using these four things that we're going to talk about today, the guideposts, we use them here at SEEK not only for community life engagement, we use them for everything. We use them to interview staff, to ask them, what do you think about, how would you implement one of these? We use them when we meet with families. We use them in staff training. We use them in supported living. We use them all the way across the board because they really are the core principles of how to help people with disabilities live, work, and thrive. Can advance? Jen, you want to take this one?
Yep. So the first guidepost is to individualize supports for each person. And this is really about getting to know the person using person-centered planning. We don't, promote one particular tool for person-centered planning, but there's lots of great tools and concepts out there for person-centered planning. And it's also individualizing supports is not necessarily about supporting people one-to-one. So, often the thing you hear is, well, we don't have the staff to do one-to-one. And it's not necessarily about one-to-one. It's about finding ways to individualize each person's day and each person's support, even if you don't have that one-to-one staffing. So maybe people are grouped with other people for an activity that they all enjoy, or with friends that they like spending time with. But you're being purposeful in thinking about when you're grouping people and how, and not just sort of putting them in a group because that's the staffing ratio. So the next slide, yep. So it's about moving from that sort of having everybody together in a location model to a model where you are one by one learning who the people are and using person-centered planning to think about what they want and designing their individualized, customized day of supports based on that. So I'm going to hand back to Karen to talk some more about that.
So when I spent some time with my team really learning about individualized supports and what that meant, we talked about what it means to be unique and that each one of us is unique. And this is a picture right here in the middle of Mercedes and Jessica, who you're going to get to see in a few minutes in a video. But Mercedes and Jessica are at a advocacy day at in Annapolis, which is our state capital. And it is not a disability advocacy day. It's just a plain advocacy day for nonprofits, I believe it was. And on the left is Lauren, and she's a weightlifter, and she is at her weightlifting competition that she does. That makes her unique. That makes her, it's not something that I do, but it is something she does. And these are the people that she does CrossFit with and does her weightlifting with. So to ask yourself, and I do think that we have to start with our own selves. Ask yourself what makes you unique. What are the things that you do? I like to share a story about my son, who is somebody who is does not live with disability, but I think it's such an interesting story about what we're talking about here. So my son, who went to the University of Minnesota for graduate school, went to the School of Public Policy, and he's a biostatistician. And he and his girlfriend, who he met in Minneapolis, she went to Macalester, they moved out to Seattle. And for Christmas this year, she bought him a cooking class at somebody's house in Seattle. So they went to this cooking class on a Sunday evening, and there were 3 other couples there, plus the woman who was cooking and teaching the class. And they just had a great time, and it could have been just that, right? It could have just been a cooking class. But instead, one of the couples they met they really hit it off with them. And they said, you want to go out and have a drink afterwards? So after their cooking class, they went out and they had a drink. And after that, they said, let's get back together again. So in a couple weeks, they got back together again. And my son said, he's only been there about 2 years. And he said, I really would like to join a book group. And the woman said, a woman from the couple said, I'm in a book group. I love being in my book group. And he said, I really love talking about books. And she said, well, my book group is all women. And he said, oh, I don't really care if it's all women or not. I really want to just be in a book group. I want to talk about books. And she said, well, you might not like our books. We just finished this book called Lessons in Chemistry. And he said, I just finished that book. I'd love to come and talk about it with you. And so as a result, my son started going to this book group, and now he's the only man in this book group. And so he is, and now he's met other people through that. And he's got other folks that he's hangs out with as a result of that book group. And it all started from this one class. So it started off with that individualization. It started off with the one thing that he liked to do. He likes to cook. She got him a gift. His partner got him that gift of the cooking class, and it grows and grows and grows. And that's what Jen was talking about earlier when she talked about who we know and how it can grow when we're out in the community. But when we're in a center-based program and the only people you have access to are people with disabilities, we don't really learn about people. We don't really know about what their uniqueness is. How often have you gotten into some sort of planning meeting with somebody and you're having a conversation and you kind of think you know this person and you got them in this little bit of a box, and all of a sudden you say, to somebody's mom, would she like to do something else? And the mom said, well, she just crocheted a quilt for her, or crocheted an Afghan for her niece. And everybody looks at each other and goes, she crochets? I had no idea she crochets. So really thinking about what makes each person you work with and yourself unique. Sometimes we don't learn those in any other way but having a cup of coffee with people. And so that's really step number one for us, is what makes us unique, because unique characteristics about people help us to lead to unique supports for that person. You can advance. So I'm going to play this video for you. This is a story about Graham and Jessica, and they hang out together with their staff a couple times a week, I think 3-4 times a week. And Mercedes is just a really skilled staff person who knows how to make sure that both of their needs are met individually.
Seek supports people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to live, work, and thrive. Mercedes is a community engagement coach. On days that Jessica and Graham are not working or studying, Mercedes supports them to facilitate their engagement with the community in a positive and meaningful way.
Always get hot chocolate there, unless it's too warm for hot drinks.
Today, we are learning more about their typical day together.
Oh yeah, there's a Metro Exit over there.
Mercedes first picks up Graham and drives to Silver Spring. There, they meet Jessica, who takes Metro Access from her group home.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Hi, Jessica.
Good morning, Jess. How are you?
Often, their first stop is Starbucks to order their favorite drinks, while Mercedes stands by to make sure the transaction goes smoothly. Jessica spends time on her iPad writing a text to her mom, while Mercedes and Graham review the day's schedule. Looking ahead to next week, Graham lets Mercedes know what activities he would like to do. One of their favorite things to do together is to visit the Silver Spring Library. There they browse and look at books, picking out their favorites and checking them out with their own library cards. While Jessica reads her new book, Graham decides he would prefer working on his word puzzle. At 11:15, the three walk downtown for lunch. Graham knows where he can go to get a slice to satisfy his pizza cravings, while Jessica opts to eat at Doghouse. Afterwards, they walk together to Jessica's Metro Access pickup spot. From there, her ride will take her to meet with Mercedes and Graham at MLK Pool. This is where Graham likes to swim on Wednesdays. It is a common misconception that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are not capable of making their own decisions. At Seek, we believe differently.
You don't like me, you like my dog. I know you. I know you.
Mercedes supports Jessica and Graham in a way that gives them choice and control over their own lives, and encourages Jessica to do many activities independently, even though her disabilities make it sometimes challenging. Community engagement allows neighbors to better see the people we support as members of their own community.
Okay, thanks in advance. Okay, so I hope that helps you kind of get an idea what we were talking about in terms of they're together, but they're getting different and unique supports. By the way, Graham only eats pizza, and the place they were going for pizza was closed, but he knew where in that area to get pizza because he knows every single pizza place that's around. Granted, it is kind of a suburban area, you know, it's not a small town. And I know that a number of people that you support live in small towns, but small towns offer those same incredibly rich resources. And I do know a lot of your small towns. I went to school in Morris for a couple years, and so I really, you know, there's opportunities in small towns that we don't ever really think about. So the first step is to really get curious, right? Here are some really good opening questions to get to know people, because we think we know the people that we work with just because we know them in one setting. But when you really start thinking about their individualization and their individual supports and what they do differently, let me just follow up with one thing about Jessica at this point. Is she goes to the community college, but she wanted to be able to order even more independently and communicate more independently. So we brought in a consultant to help us, and she's using her iPad now, and she's actually ordering her Starbucks every day or whatever it is that she goes to get to drink by herself on her Starbucks. So when she goes in, she just picks it up. So really giving her that autonomy to be able to get that kind of support. So her support really focused around the technology, which is not really a big thing for Graham. He still uses a flip phone. So Mercedes supports them in very different ways according to their own uniqueness. But if you can really get curious about people and to start really thinking about what makes each person incredibly unique, you start to be able to build the building blocks of the work that we're talking about. Just a couple of things give you those building blocks. You can go ahead. Stacey's going to launch a poll. Okay. So if you could, my organization provides training to staff in person-centered planning and or thinking approaches. Are you learning how to do some of these things that I'm talking about? Are you learning to start with the person rather than with a group, or start with what the person is telling us versus starting with what is available, right? So starting with that, are you starting with that person? That's a really hard paradigm to shift.
And this is Danielle. I clearly had a typo putting the polls, and I apologize. The final selection should be strongly agree rather than too strongly disagree. Sorry about that.
Okay. So we're looking at about 16% of the people feel like maybe they could use some more, 3%, but a lot of agrees. So there's a lot of folks that believe that you are getting some person-centered planning and thinking. That's wonderful to hear.
In fact,
Okay.
we've been in New Hampshire, person-centered planning and thinking has been a hot topic of late. So we've been having a lot of conversations about what does person-centered planning look like? What does person-centered service planning look like? What's the difference? What's person-centered thinking? All of them are good things to be thinking about, and a great foundation for supporting community life engagement in an individualized way. So we're going to move on now to Guidepost 2, which is promote community membership and contribution. And this starts with physically getting out in the community, but that's really like the most basic level. What it's really about is being engaged, being involved, community membership, contributing back through volunteer work, ensuring that the way staff, that the presence of staff doesn't limit the connection of somebody with their community. So, you know, there's a big difference between taking a whole group of people to Starbucks and the staff orders for them versus taking a couple people to Starbucks and having them order for themselves, and maybe even they keep going back to the same Starbucks, so they start to know some of the regulars and the staff. Those are the kind of things that can really get from just physically being in the community to starting to feel more connected and belonging in the community. So and this is another example, you know, taking people on a group outing to go bowling or something can be fun. I mean, there's nothing wrong with taking people on group outings or doing a field trip to a museum or something, but it's not necessarily the way that people connect to their communities. It's going back over time to the same places, doing things like volunteering every week at the soup kitchen, which might be what the people on the right are doing. Going to the same church community each week, joining the local choir and rehearsing with them each week. Those are the kind of places where we really get to establish that sense of membership and contribution.
So I do remember going to I think it was a TASH conference many years ago, and there was a provider, I think like down in like in Medalia down in that area, and they had decided to get rid of their program, and instead they started to use the community. And it was a great example of how even in a small town there's ways that people belong, and maybe even more so in a small town. So whether you're in the cities or in one of the bigger towns, up in St. Cloud or Mankato or Duluth or something, or if you're in a local small town, those relationships and the people that are that they know, I mean, it might be a cousin or a relative or somebody that people have membership and belonging with. And we sometimes are taking people away from those relationships and memberships. And as we start to go back out into the community, you know, you'll hear, of course, you know, oh, that's so-and-so's niece, and oh, that's, you know, you hear those things. I know you do. And so we want to reignite some of those relationships and some of those memberships and presence that people have. And there really is a difference between membership and presence. So I think Jen used the example. So here on the left, we have this, you know, it's a disability tennis group. But on the right, we have a woman who is reading story time to kids at the local library. There's a difference between being present in the community and really being a member of the community. And it's subtle, but you all know it. You feel it in your own lives, right? You feel it in your own lives when you know, if you go to church and you sit in the back and you get up and leave before the end of the day, versus if you're sitting at the church and you're helping with Sunday social hour and you're making the coffee, right? There's a big difference between presence and membership. And we're talking about membership specifically for people who have been isolated or separated for so long, about how to bring people back into membership. You can advance. So how do people belong? How do they belong now? Do they only belong and do we only identify them as members of a disability group, as members of a certain DAHAB or workshop or organization? How is it that we recognize people, and how are they recognized by other people in their community? What are they members of? You can go ahead. So these are some pictures of some folks that belong in a really interesting way. So in the lower left-hand corner, this guy's name is Savario, and he is somebody who goes to a senior center to make smoothies for people. And he does this once a week, and he takes orders from the people that are there. This is his gift to people who are in the, it's how he wanted to spend his money. He wants to make smoothies. He loves senior citizens and he loves talking to them. And so he belongs by going to these senior centers and going to the senior center and making smoothies. And so he has like 4 different kinds of smoothie and he lets them choose. Down in the lower left-hand corner or in the middle, that's Ava, who has got the red and white striped shirt on or plaid shirt on, and that's one of her neighbors. So Ava figured out that by going outside and sitting in the courtyard, that she could meet people who have dogs. And then she could say to them, could I walk with you? Could I walk with your dogs? Because Ava wants a dog, but she doesn't really want to take care of a dog. So she really loves animals. And so now she's got about 4 or 5 people that she hangs out with. She knows when they're going to be downstairs. She knows when they're going to be in the courtyard. And she goes down and she walks their dogs with them. And she talks to them and she's got these relationships with them. Down below in the middle there, that's Lindsay, and she is at a art class at a, it's not an arts and crafts class, it's at our community college, and it is a class that she has joined. She's got close to having her AA in art, practical art, because she loves to do art and different types of art. So she is actually a member of a class that's there. Over to the right is Jeremy. He just moved into his own apartment. Jeremy's one of those guys that's got a lot of reputations and titles and things after his names, because he gets a lot of support to make sure that he stays healthy through the day. And but we found that when Jeremy did his own grocery shopping and paid for his own groceries, that the people at the grocery store recognized him, they talked to him, he could ask for help, they would help him. He goes to the same grocery store every single week to do his grocery shopping. And because he goes at the same time, the same people are working there, and he has a relationship with them. Can advance? Those are just some examples of what we're talking about. Okay, poll number 2. My organization provides training to staff on how to identify and build natural supports in a non-work service, right? So this is a tough one because, you know, I think that we as disability providers think that our job has, if I'm not right next to that person, cueing them all the time, that I'm not doing the job that they need to be, you know, that I'm not doing the job I'm supposed to be doing. And it's really difficult, I think, for our direct support professionals to recognize and to be rewarded for getting out of the way. So rather than just being right there, how are you getting out of the way? And that's a great question around thinking about if Jessica uses her iPad, then that's a natural support in the non-work service, right? That's not, you know, it's not like a job coach or anything. It's, but using the iPad. And did you notice that when Graham went to the counter to buy his or to pay for his swimming, he did it himself. He didn't have Mercedes there saying, Graham, put it up there, Graham, take it out there. And Mercedes didn't get up there and do it for him. So those are really great examples. And so, okay. So what we see is that 24% of people say they don't know how to do this. This is not something we talk about. 21% say, I don't think so. 52% say that they do, that you are trained on how to use natural supports and build those natural supports. That's really wonderful. And 3% or 1 person says that, yeah, definitely we do that.
And I think one of the challenges here too is that when we talk about natural supports, it's historically been something that people think about in employment. And so sometimes even the same agencies that are trying to build natural supports on the job site for somebody might not think of it in that sort of day services. They're still thinking of that in terms of something that the staff need to do with people.
Yeah.
In their non-work activities.
Go forward.
Which is a great segue into guidepost 3, using human and social capital to decrease dependence on paid support. So as it says in the slide here, this means decrease dependence on support. It doesn't mean that everyone gets to a point where they don't need any support or they can do it alone. It means that staff are getting out of the way and figuring out other ways to support people. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about what human and social capital are. So human capital is the set of skills that anybody has that they bring to their job, that they bring to their life. It's the skills that they have within themselves. Social capital is the set of relationships that we have out in the world and the value that we get out of those relationships. So I like to use transportation as an example for this. There tends to be this idea that, oh, we can't take everybody out because we don't have enough vans, is something I hear sometimes. Like, we need enough van space to take everyone out in the community. And that's just kind of a mindset that the service provider needs to be transporting everybody in a company vehicle. There might be people who can build their skills, their human capital, to take the bus on their own, or maybe just to take the bus with a buddy and get somewhere on their own. It might be that once they've gone someplace for a while, they might build those relationships, that social capital, to ask somebody for a ride. They discover that somebody in their neighborhood goes to the same choir practice and is happy to give them a ride home. And so by thinking of it this way, it takes some of that burden off the service system to be shuttling people around, and that those resources, both staff time and money, can be used to support people as they're needed in those activities, and to support people in identifying the right activities rather than spending those resources getting them there.
So I don't know, do we have the chat open? I don't know if we have the chat open for people to put something in. But I'm just wondering if folks have strategies that they use to help to get people out of the way. I know that we as an organization have really struggled with this. We've really struggled with hand over hand, like kind of saying, my job is to be here to make sure that we get this outcome, right? So if it's making a peanut butter sandwich, we're taking a person's hand and making them make a peanut butter sandwich because that's what their goal is. So we've really spent a lot of time over the last 20 years or 30 years teaching direct support professionals, making that sandwich is the most important thing. And so our mindset is that staff have to be in the way, right? So how often have you been somewhere and Mrs. Jones comes up and sees Stevie and says, "Hey, Stevie, how are you doing?" And the direct support staff says, "Stevie, answer Mrs. Jones. Tell Mrs. Jones how you are. Tell Mrs. Jones how you are." And you just kind of cringe because you're like, how do we get out of the way for that? How do we get out of that way so that Mrs. Jones and Stevie can have that natural interaction together? Because us being in the way is what we've been taught to do. So it's really a retraining. And so I'm wondering if folks have strategies that they've used. I know we've talked about staff standing behind somebody rather than standing in between someone in the community and them. I have to say that one of the easiest ways, and certainly probably I'm hoping the beginning of this process, is what you see here on the bottom. And that's Minaj, who is buying something at I think it's a library actually. Something that he has to put his library card in for, and the staff are out of the way, right? So that seems to be the easiest way to start is between a person who sits behind a desk, whether it's a cashier or a clerk or a librarian, whoever it is, and then the person you support who's going in to get something, because they tend to, we see that as a natural relationship. But how do we do that in other ways? How do we get out of the way? How do we let people develop those relationships? I certainly think we have done a fine job of making people prompt dependent. So they end up not saying hello to anybody till we say hello to him, right? And how do we undo that so people can have those natural kinds of relationships? So up on the top is a picture of Lynn's, and she is doing her fitness class with her athletic trainer that she uses, that her family pays for because they want her to have this fitness opportunity. And so how are we getting out of the way so that that's who her instructor is somebody who really is a fitness person, not one of our direct support staff. You can advance it. Okay, so my organization supports individuals to form friendships with people outside of the IDD system. Think about this too in not just how you may do this in people's homes, but how you do this kind of all day long. I think this is really it's really a tough thing. We may want to do it, but do we actually spend the time training our teams to be able to do this? Learning how to make friends and helping people to create those opportunities, I think, is incredibly difficult. So we're sharing, you see, so most people say yes, that they do. You do talk about how to make friends, of course, right? Minnesota Nice. So you would be the leaders in that, right? Great, thanks.
All right, so we're going to move on to guidepost 4, which is ensuring that supports are outcome-oriented and regularly monitored. So this is about thinking about what the goal is, looking at what's being accomplished, thinking about how can we improve on what we're doing. Often the best service providers are the ones that are constantly looking for, or the best of really anything, are the ones that are constantly looking for a way to do it better. And it's about both looking at the individual's goals, so that kind of circles back to the person-centered planning piece. What are that person's goals, and how are the activities they're doing and the supports they're receiving contributing to those goals? And also your organizational vision. Have you thought about what your vision is for how you want to support people with disabilities and promote their independence and inclusion in the community, and whether the way you're providing support matches up with that vision? I think, we've all seen organizations that have these great slogans, but then when you look at what they're doing, it doesn't necessarily line up with what the slogan says. So thinking about those things and making sure that then when you're collecting information on the support you're doing, you're not just sort of collecting the kind of information you need to comply with things like staffing ratios and safety protocols, but you're also collecting information on, do people feel like they're supported in the level of engagement that they want? Do they feel like they're reaching the goals that they want? Are you collecting feedback from the people that you support and really using that feedback to think about not only how does better support that individual, but also how does the organization as a whole operate better?
We use the term here at SEEK, for the sake of what? Why are you doing that? For the sake of what? Why is it that we're doing something for the sake of what? And I think that when we started to practice asking that question, we started to have a different kind of dialogue. So a lot of the people we support, because we need to know when they need support and when they don't need support. So as Jen said, You know, we don't think of this as a program. It's really how people live into their own lives and how they live into their own community. But we're programs that have infrastructures, and we've got a certain amount of dollars, and we've got a certain amount of staffing, and we've got a certain amount of times that we need to be with people, or they need to be outside of their homes, or if they've got families that are working. So we have to really ask ourselves often, for the sake of what? Why is it that we're doing things? So this really came true for Brett. We oftentimes, and I'll tell you some statistics, because I work with the Department of Labor. I happen to have access to lots of statistics. So the average number of years that people are in a sheltered workshop, remember, sheltered workshops were supposed to be where you go and learn a skill to go out and work in the community. Do you know? Take a guess, toss it in the chat. Anybody have any guesses about how long you think the average length of stay? 25, 6, 22, good guesses. The answer is 54. It's down. It used to be 56, so it's actually down 2 years. So the good news is that we're maybe making some progress here. And so 54 years is how long the average person goes into a sheltered workshop and they don't come out. Because the truth is, we really struggle to ask why we're doing something, what it is that we're doing. So I'm going to take you on a little journey with Brett. So Brett also is somebody who has a lot of reputations. You'll see, I'm going to play you a video of Brett, but he has also has had a lot of reputations for things that he's done. You can't really tell this here, but he's about 6'7", 6'6". He is, you can tell he's a big guy, but you can't tell he's a really big guy. So when he gets upset and his voice raises, people get a little freaked out being around him. And so Brett really wanted to work. His mom wanted him to work. He knew that that was the right thing to do. When he's in an environment where there's lots of chaos, which is oftentimes what happens in any kind of center-based program, just the nature of the beast, you see this raising of the temperature and inability to kind of relax and stay focused. And so we were trying to figure out how to support Brett to have a decent resume, decent experiences, and to gain those skills like Jen talked about, both the human capital, which is his personal skills, and the social capital, which is his connections in the community. And so he started doing a volunteer gig at Brookside Gardens, which is kind of like the Arboretum, or any kind of place. It's a park here, big park. And his job was to work with bird seed and the bird feed. And as a big guy, he could do things that other people couldn't do, like carry the 50-pound bag of bird seed and put it in the garbage can where it where they use it to, all the different volunteers who work at Brookside Gardens could fill the bird feeders. So he really started to develop some skills around cleaning the house where they keep all of the bird seed, filling the bird seed, independently walking to all of the different feeders and cleaning them and putting the feed in it. I think here he's got a corn husk, and I'm sure that that's for the squirrels who get kicked off of every bird feeder around, right? But that wasn't really enough for him. And so really looking at that deep breathing and different strategies that he needed to learn to be successful. So he wasn't just doing this for the sake of doing it, and he wasn't doing it for the sake of forever. There was really an outcome that Brett was looking at. How do we get ready for work? How does he learn how to do some of those things that will help him in the long run? So we worked with the trainer, and we have hired as a community engagement organization, we've hired a trainer. He works 20 hours a week, and he goes to different community centers, and people come in and they get one-on-one training with him. And they generally, he'll do like, he'll start off Brett for 15 minutes, and he'll work with Brett, and somebody else will come in, and Brett will keep doing whatever it is that he's doing, whether it's the treadmill or lifting weights or the bike or whatever. And the guy will go on to the second person. And then, so he's kind of got this 15-minute rotation. So he brings people in and out all day long. But we've hired this athletic trainer who does this work. Because our direct support staff are not professional athletic trainers. They don't really understand the characteristics and components of helping people to increase their physical fitness. I will tell you, when we went from a center-based program to a community program and did things like starting to hire an athletic trainer, we saw things happen like people who had been on type 2 diabetes medicines went off of them. We saw people's stamina who could only really walk a short while walk, and now they're working. We saw the fall risk really decreasing for people that are older. We saw a really tremendous change. So that's one of the strategies that we as an organization used, was hiring a part-time athletic trainer, which did not cost us that much. And because we weren't paying for a building anymore, we had some extra revenue because we sold our building, and we used that money to pay for some of these other really wonderful things. I know a lot of times we hear that when people leave center-based programs, that they lose their friends, that we don't want to leave their friends. So we helped Brett to find a basketball league that he and his friends could join together, so that he had an opportunity to see his friends kind of in a normally occurring situation. And then while he was there, because he was going to the same place to volunteer 3 days a week, he learned to take the bus in the metro. He learned how to take the bus to the volunteer site. So now he's got way more human capital, because he had coworkers and colleagues at the Brookside Gardens. They also have like a store at Brookside Gardens, and he was starting to go in and open up boxes and stuff like that. And that gave folks the idea that Brett could maybe do more than what it is that he'd been doing. And so he probably did this stuff maybe for 6 to 9 months. And we really got a lot of information. We use customized employment and discovery. So we got a lot of information from Brett during this time, being able to observe him, tweak his job, get him a little bit more skill, and so on. So we're going to play a video for you next. Go ahead. And this was Brett's outcome with community engagement.
Well, you can go first.
Hi, my name is Brett. Nice to meet you. I work at UPS Warehouse.
Hi, my name is Willow Newman. I've been working with Brett here at UPS for almost 2 years through SEEK. Brett is an unloader. He unloads boxes from the conveyor belts and is very good at his job. He's been here for almost 2 years.
Brett's a hard worker. He's in here every day. Brett has been a very diligent part of our unload force. You can always count on that he's going to be here. He knows what he wants to do. He comes in, asks for the truck, and goes right to the truck and goes working. He works very well with anyone that you put in there with the truck with him. Everyone in there has always had good experiences with Brett.
He's a funny guy. He's hilarious. He's actually pretty easy to talk to, especially when I was having a tougher day in the building. I could go and hammer out a truck with Brett and kind of reset my mind.
Well, I enjoy most being here working with Brett. His ability to do the work, come into work happy, and making anyone account that he's here. Because when Brett come in, you know he's here. Because everybody hear him. He's like, I'm here. Did you clock in? Did you punch in? So that's the best thing that I love with him. He's happy all the time.
Okay, you can advance to the next slide. There you go. Okay. So I think that's a great example. We did have an outcome in mind for Brett. We didn't just do it forever and ever and ever. I know sometimes when we work with people who are doing a volunteer gig, that we just keep going with the same thing. We don't ever ask ourselves, we don't never ask ourselves for the sake of what, why are they doing this? What's the outcome that we're trying to get to? Why is it we're doing this other than, oh, it's there and it's free, right? Sometimes that is a good answer, but it can't be the answer all the time. It has to start with the person. It has to be meaningful to them so that they can thrive and continue to grow. So just a little exercise for you to do. We could do this on your own when we're done today, but think of something and somebody that you support that's been doing the same thing over and over again, right? They do Thursday bowling and they've been doing it for 22 years, right? Not that people don't want to keep doing their bowling for 22 years, but is there something else? Is it time to make a change? Is there, we really didn't get there. The one thing I will tell you, and this is from years and years and years, and as I said, I started at Op Shop, and back when there was no thing called supported employment back then. It's just people got jobs, and I was the residential counselor, but I also had to support people at their jobs. So I've been working in the employment world for a really long time. And even though I look really young, I'm not. And so I know people sometimes believe that some volunteer situations can turn into something paid, but in my career, I've probably supported maybe 1500 to 2,000 people. And I would say one time has a volunteer gig turned into a paid gig. And that's one of those things that I think we have to be really incredibly careful about. Remember, I went back to that very beginning when I said, if I could stop somebody from making the mistakes that we did and have you go right to success rather than having to go through the continuum of mistakes we did, that's one of them, is that helping people to find a volunteer gig and then they stay there way too long, or we make the assumption that maybe someday possibly could be that they'll get paid and they never do. And so that really, what a better time. Your unemployment rate is about 3% right now. What a better time to be looking for community employment. There's no better time than when you're in the kind of economic situation that you are in. And I know Minnesota's unemployment rate is generally pretty low, but it's really low right now. So the needs are really out there of employers. So to really think about, have they been doing something long enough? Are we ready to try something new? For the sake of what? What is the outcome in mind? Why are we doing something with somebody? Is there really a purpose? So how do you know when it's time to try something new? Are you talking about that in staff meetings? Are you sharing ideas with one another? Are you challenging one another? Are you challenging? And I know sometimes for people who live at home with their families, that comfort of same thing over and over and over again is very comforting, but we've got to be, as professionals, we've got to be challenging that status quo. So are you regularly reviewing data to improve those supports? And the data we're talking about is, if we said everybody works, is everybody working? Not just, did people get this one thing or did people get that other thing, but really looking at the data that says, if we're an employment first state, are people really getting the option and the opportunity to work? I will tell you that NCI, the National Core Indicators, what we know is that we've got about 20% of people in the United States who have intellectual and developmental disabilities working, and about 54% say they want to work. I don't know the Minnesota numbers specifically, but I do know that the number is around 54 nationally that people want to work. So are we really looking at that? I know we think we're doing a great job of looking at people on an annual basis, but are we really being honest with ourselves? I think that's a really important question. Okay, you can see the results. We've got 12% say, nope, we're not doing that. Another 19 but some people say, yeah, we are really doing that. We're really looking at our data and saying that we're doing exactly what it is that folks want. Remembering that if it's 54%, it's 54% at your agency and 54% at mine. It's not 0 at mine and 50 and 100 over at that one, right? Remember, that's the way those statistics work. We have to be really honest with ourselves about. Great. This is a great, you're going to get this PowerPoint, right? They're going to get the PowerPoint. This is something I would print and have laying around everywhere. I think it reminds everybody. This is Jen's created some of these really great tools. So these are the guideposts for support. We just went through all 4 of them. As I said, my personal belief is that they're not just for community life engagement, even though that was what her original intent is. Think about supported living, think about employment supports, think about all of the work that we do, think about family supports. All of these values, all of these practices should be embedded into our training, into our way of thinking, into our annual planning process, everything we do. I really like this. It's great to see. It's easy to read, easy to understand. So I encourage you to really take a look at these community life engagement guideposts and the fidelity scale and try to figure out how you can integrate it into your organization at all levels. So are there any questions? I think this is it, right? Do we have another?
I think so too. This is a great question to end on, though. Is anybody going away from this with some ideas of something that they want to try, or did anything strike you in this conversation? Or any questions for us?
And Jen and Karen, I am monitoring the chat. I'm not sure if you can see it, but no questions yet, but I'll keep an eye out.
Okay. You know, I think one of the things to be really careful about that Jen talked about was it's not a program, right? But we as providers do need infrastructures. You know, we've got policies and procedures. And if you're doing this for one person, it's super easy to just kind of do it for one person. But when you have to change how your staffing pattern is and change how you do things, you do need to have an infrastructure around this. And I think that's one of the really nice things for you about being a part of this transformation and transition group is you have access to professionals like Stacy and Danielle and other people who can help you to think through how you create the infrastructures or change and transform your current infrastructures, because it is absolutely a different infrastructure. All the staff have to have phones, they have to have laptops, they have to have access to your online portal things that you do out in the community. A lot of those things are very, very different. So Lisa asked, I'd be curious to know how this philosophy can work with people who rely on more physical disabilities. What does it look like? So that's a great question. When we shut down our center-based program back we started in around 2000 and 2005. When we got down to the end, we had 30 people who were still in the center, and we were trying to figure out how to help folks to move into the community. And 10 of them we just hadn't gotten to. It was not going to be a problem. 10 of them had families that said, over my dead body, this is not going to happen. And 10 of them were people who really were a challenge. Either people who had such significant physical disabilities that they needed some nursing support, they needed those kinds of supports, or they needed to their mobility was slow. They didn't use a chair or walker or anything, but their mobility was slow, and so it meant we did things different. And I don't want to be trite, because it's a very, very good question, and it's serious. But you have to figure out this stuff one person at a time when you get to that point. And we did multiple different things. So in some situations, we met people at their home and we went out. I remember a woman that we worked with named Joni, and we started her day at her home, and she needed to, about every 2.5, 3 hours, she needed to get out of her wheelchair and be on an incline. And so we actually did use her home to do that. We would go back home and we would be there for maybe, and it maybe 20, 25 minutes, and let her lay out, do a little massage for her, and then go back out again. And we would come in and out a couple times a day, because she did have those needs. I think that you have to do those one at a time. And the interesting thing is, a strategy that we used is, when we got down to that last 10, we said, how are we going to solve this? And I brought my best and my most creative folks to the table, and I said, okay, it's 2:00 on a Friday afternoon and nobody leaves until we figure these 10 people out. And I'll tell you, creative minds really came to the table. I think that we'd been thinking about these folks for a year or two, and all of a sudden, when it was a Friday afternoon and people wanted to get out, their creative juices flowed, and we really did think through how we're going to do that. And for some people, we were able to figure out how to use like a swim center, or how to use a community resource. We had one person was volunteering at the Bethesda Naval Hospital. Actually, now it's called Walter Reed. And we went to the volunteer folks there and said, he needs to have the ability to lay out once a day. And we hired a corpsman for $5 who would come in and help us to transfer this person onto a blow-up mattress that we brought, and so that he could get changed. And then he went back, then the corpsman would come back a half an hour later and help us put him in the chair. But you can't solve that stuff in a group. That stuff is only stuff that you can solve with people who know them, who know the community, and who are close to it. So it is trite to say one person at a time, but when you really do just talk about Andy, right, you really do have to figure it out. Who does Andy know? How is Andy connected? What are his real needs? Is there anything we could change around about his supports or services? And so you really do have to solve those things one person at a time. Oh, yes. So if you're trying to get rid of center base, what do you have individuals do that cannot work? Nonverbal, physical disabilities, major sensory needs. Small towns, we don't have coffee shops and very limited hours at the library. I think that's a great question. And again, you got to solve it one person at a time. And so we are used to thinking about what we do. The van comes, it picks them up, it brings them to this place. They're there for the day. We do this kind of stimulation stuff. The van comes back, and then they go back home again. And so, the question is, how do we think differently about that person, right? What is really important to them? So let's not think program. Let's not think that schedule. Let's not think for that person how we do that. I will tell you that here in our county, we're incredibly rich with resources. And we've got 2 providers in our county who have literally taken their day program and moved them into a center, into a recreation center, like a rec center. And boy, is it causing so many problems. We're, the county council's getting phone calls from other patrons there. And so that is not the answer. The mall, the rec center, those things are not the answer. So I think you really have to start again one person at a time, and not to be trite, but I think you really do have to think through what's important to them, what is it they need, what is the kind of support they have, who do they know? Jen talked about that social capital. We come to find out that their aunt owns the local quilt shop, and she would love to have him there for a couple hours because people hang out on Tuesdays and do such and such. And I know that I wish that there was a single answer that could give you everything you need for everybody, but it really is one person at a time trying to solve this, and you've got to start with somebody. I wouldn't start with the person who has the least amount of connections. I wouldn't start with the person who has the most significant support needs. I'd start with somebody and learn from your mistakes about how you do this. Jen, you have some thoughts?
I think one thing too that we observed in terms of like small towns is when we did our case studies and our pilot project work, we did it in both more rural areas and larger cities. So we looked at service providers in different types of settings. And what we found was that they both had their advantages and their challenges. So small towns don't have as many places to go, but they do have tighter social networks. Everybody knows everybody. There might be informal ways that people connect, or, it might take more of that sort of networking and interpersonal outreach to figure out what people do with their day when they're not going to the center. But then the challenge sometimes with large cities is you could take people to a different museum every day, but that's not community life engagement. You can go to Washington, D.C. and go to a different museum for free every day for a month, but you're not necessarily meeting people and making those connections or really meeting the purpose and the goals of community life engagement if that's all you're doing. So sometimes it's actually harder to make friends and get to know people in a city because of that anonymity that people have. So it goes both ways.
Yeah.
It just needs to be sort of tailored to where you are.
So my grandma owned a restaurant in Dawson, Minnesota. And so I grew up on my in the summers, I'd go out for a week and to the restaurant and kind of live that life that everybody lives out in Dawson, which is a town of about 1,000 people, or not even that maybe now. And I know that first thing in the morning, we'd walk up to the cafe. She owned the Lee's Cafe and on Highway 12, and you would see the same people there every morning, and there's the number 2 cookie and a cup of coffee, and people would walk in and they'd say hello to each other, and they knew each other, and when they were done, they went back to their farms, or they went back to their jobs downtown, or whatever it is that they were doing. And then I know that with my grandma, I would go down to the bank, to do her morning deposit, and we would see people there. And so I think that even in a small town that doesn't have rec centers and libraries and those kinds of things, there are other things that are going on for people. And remember, we are talking about employment. So if we believe that everybody has a contribution to make, and I know that that's hard if you haven't been through some of the work around helping people to make a contribution, and maybe they're making a contribution by delivering things for somebody, somebody maybe they're delivering lunch out to a couple different farms where people are, and that's what their job is, right? Maybe they get with their support staff, they're doing that. So when we think of employment, we think of it in a really traditional way, but how are people contributing? So I wouldn't leave out the idea of people with significant disabilities, and so of working. So how can you combine some of this community life engagement and as a wraparound to employment of some sort of maybe micro enterprise or self-employment or something like that, about making something and delivering them to the nursing home or something. And I think there's so many different opportunities out there, and I know that the work that you're doing with the folks from from the two ICIs, you got them both, you'll be able to spend some time learning and thinking about how people with the most significant disabilities find a place in the world of work that's not traditional wage job, that's not a 9 to 5, that's not working at the restaurant, that's not doing that. And so community life engagement turns out to be a wraparound to that for folks, and so that's really important. Somebody asked the question about, did you decrease the number of hours? We did not decrease the number of hours. So when they went back to their house, it was their day staff that were with them at the house. And now, especially with the settings rule where everybody has to have access to their own, whether they're in a group home or their own home or their family home or whatever, people need to have access and a key to their own homes at all times. And so, yeah, that is an issue. But no, we did not decrease the number of hours for people at all. We just maybe changed how we thought about where they were getting their supports and what they were doing. One woman who needs to be home for medical purposes, she cooks, she makes, as a part of her weekly activities, 1 day a week she cooks treats and brings them to the local fire station, and that's part of what she does. And we just kind of made that up for her because she does need to be in the house a certain amount of hours to get an infusion every day. But she still is doing something productive. And then when she's done, she takes them I think her specialty is like peanut butter Rice Krispie bars or something like that. I know people, I've heard stories about the firefighters' love of this. Again, this is not easy. It's one person at a time. You're not going to figure it out for a group. You're going to figure it out one person at a time. You're going to make big mistakes. You're going to learn from it. You're going to get better at it. You're going to get a different reputation in the community so that people eventually come to you in a different way. You're going to work with the school system to help them think about how the people are making contributions and relationships in school. It does take time, but it's worth it when you start it.
Karen, I wonder if you could talk for a minute, thinking about provider organizations for whom this might be new information, and that means their direct support staff may be unfamiliar with providing supports in this way. Can you talk a little bit about how you would recommend introducing some of these concepts to DSPs and helping to mentor them to develop some of these skills?
I got to tell you, the guideposts say it all. So I would use the guideposts. One of the things, the strategies that we used the guideposts for in the beginning was we use Teams because we're not center-based. Everybody's out in the community. So we do messages and all that kind of stuff. So everybody has access to technology and they all have cell phones. It was something we were able to do when we stopped having a building that we had to pay for. In all the things that happen in a building and new roofs and all that kind of stuff. And so because they had access to the technology, we have we share stories, but you could do that in a center right now. You could do that where you, in a staff meeting weekly, where you share stories and say, let's start with the individualization story, right? So on Monday, maybe we're going to talk about what it is and give some examples, and everybody go around and say how they think about individualizing supports for the people they're working with, and then have them go out for the week and then have them come back and tell the stories again. Share pictures. We're using in Teams, we use a channel called Shared Stories. That's kind of interesting, Shared Stories, and people post pictures and they tell stories. And so we would have a week where everybody was supposed to be telling a story on there. And some people are good at it, some people aren't good at it, and some people take lots of pictures and post, and folks, give big hearts to it and emojis and all that kind of stuff. And so then the staff get rewarded. I will say that there is a level of problem solving that is different when you are doing this support than when you're in a center based, right? Because you could be at a McDonald's and they've got a men's and a women's bathroom and there's a man who needs to go into the bathroom. You're not going to take him into the women's bathroom. What do? There's a level of problem solving that's very different when you're in the community than when you're in the center. And so I think absolutely talking about that. And that's how we started. We started with a pilot team, and that's what we called them, was the pilot team. We're so original. And we took, we asked people that we supported that lived in one geographic area and staff that were also living close to or in that geographic area, because they knew the resources, they knew what was out there, they knew what to do. So we started with that pilot. We probably met for about a month ahead of time and really talked about what would the day look like, how would it flow for people, how did it feel, what are the bus lines that are easy. We gave everybody a backpack and it had, you know, information in it. It had, you know, at the time, it was, this is so long ago, we didn't have laptops for everybody, but it had cameras in it because not everybody got cell phones. We had little flip phones. We had, you know, little first aid kits. We had pencils and papers and Post-its and little cards about here's who we are and this is what we're doing, so they could hand out. And everybody had these kind of backpacks that they took with them. And then we figured out, because of the Board of Nursing and the requirements around nursing, we figured out that because your medication has to be locked inside of something that's locked. And so we got banker's bags, and we took a banker's bag that was this big and we put the medication in it, and then we locked it and we put it in a banker's bag that was this big and we locked it, and we went, look, we've got a double locked bag. So you do have to solve that stuff one person at a time, but the DSPs know that information. So I think just really sitting down with people and talking through it and talking about that. I mean, they've been trained to handle the kinds of emergencies that they can call, hey, help me, I need an extra person here. And there were, by the way, a couple people who had such significant behavioral support needs that we did start with 2 staff, but we knew once they got acclimated, we would decrease the staff. And that's exactly what happened. So maybe a short period of time, maybe 2 to 4 months, there were 2 people that did have 2-on-1 staff because of their behavior support needs. But once they got acclimated to the community, they didn't even need 1-to-1 supports because that was such a better place for them to be.
And I just want to point out Jen's comment in the chat. Thank you, Jen. She dropped the link to the community life engagement toolkit, which we also will send in a follow-up email. But as Jen notes, these guideposts are also have some examples, strategies, and resources that are worth perusing. We are at the end of our time, and I want to give a really great thank you to Karen and to Jen for such a great presentation. And again, there will be a follow-up email with all of the contents. It also includes Karen and Jen's email addresses if there's any follow-up questions that didn't get addressed. We'll also include a really short survey so you can give us some feedback on this presentation, and we appreciate everybody taking the time to sign in today. Thank you both.
Yeah, thank you for having us. I wish I were there.
And Danielle just dropped the survey link in the chat box if people want to grab it now. It's a very short survey. It will only take a minute or 2 of your time. And you also have the opportunity to share with our team if there are additional topic areas that you'd like to hear about or anything additional you'd like to share with us. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.